Hello, everyone. It is a great honor to be here with Dave and Rachel. Stephanie did such an amazing opening, and I was thinking, wow, she just stole my opening. I was going to do the word association thing, too. But seriously, at least I can take credit for having hired her. But in any case, I'm going to start off by just having, we're going to have Dave start off by talking a little bit about WeWork, about the company itself. Rachel is then going to give a presentation, and then I'm going to have a Q&A with them. So that's how we're going to go. Going to go along. So Dave, do you want to start us off with what you want to share about the company?
So I just wanted to sort of give everyone a sense of what WeWork is. I think that different people have different ideas of what we are. So just to kind of level set a little bit. And maybe with a little bit of the origin of the company. It was founded by Miguel McKelvey and Adam Newman, who both happened to grow up in some sort of communal living environment. Adam in a kibbutz in Israel, and Miguel in sort of an organic commune in Eugene, Oregon. And it was really interesting that they found themselves together, both working in this building in Brooklyn in about 2006 or 2007. And they both realized at the time that part of the hardest thing about the experience they were going through was sort of a lack of a social support infrastructure. And they really built this great bond talking about the businesses they were starting and how if they could really sort of productize that experience, it would do so much for people that were starting businesses. So they launched a company called Green Desk, which was kind of like an early version of WeWork, sold that company. That was pretty quick, but then used that to start WeWork with the idea to focus on small businesses and to really remove all the externalities from doing what they love, right? And you'll see that oftentimes on our sort of signage and things is do what you love, or our mission, which is to make a world where people work to make a life. I always get it backwards. I knew I was going to do this. But to make a life and not just a living is essentially the premise. And so, to be working for something bigger than us. And that's the why we do what we do. And there's just fundamental belief that when people come together, they can do more amazing things than they can on their own. And so with the sort of tactical aspect of it was the most difficult thing when you're starting a business, at least their belief was dealing with your space. And that your space isn't often designed to bring people together. You just kind of like sign a lease if you can, and that I'm not going to bore anyone with the details of how painful that process is. But then you kind of just throw some furniture in there and you start working. And they said, well, if we could actually make that an experience that is designed and architected so that people come together, the outcomes will be that much greater. And especially for these small companies, if they can be surrounded by other small companies that are looking to do amazing things, they could all really benefit from that. And that was kind of the founding principle of WeWork and the first building that was in Chinatown in New York City. And now we're at about 230 buildings all over the world, in about 60 cities, 20 countries. And we're about 4,500 people globally. Part of the way we've been able to do what we do is a lot of vertical integration and research and analysis of how people want to work and what are the things that we can do to environments so they can be more sort of communally oriented. And the problem space has become much more complex. It's not just about entrepreneurs or gig workers or sort of small business entrepreneurs. Now we've got large enterprise organizations. We've got academic institutions that are doing startup labs or incubators. And so now the type of work or the type of activities that is happening in the buildings has become really interesting. We've kind of got this big petri dish of people working in different ways with each other across the globe and different time zones. And in the sense of like social networks, it's not that big. We're about 220,000 members, but it's a physical social network, and people are always together all the time. So that makes it really interesting and really fascinating. And Rachel's going to talk a little bit about some of the research that we do to learn from it, so that we can inform how we produce space and the kinds of interventions that we can do and iterate on to create these sort of communal collisions.
And just in just a second, Rich, I just want to also draw out a couple of things you said there, Dave, just because I think it's really helpful in understanding the company is, when we think co-working spaces, I think you're right, we often think of individuals going in and just, hoteling or getting a desk for a day or something. But that's not really what the business model is. It sounds like it's more that you might have some of those people, but it's also, you have companies that are buying membership, right? Either small startups or larger companies that are now having their workers work in some of these spaces. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and co-working's kind of a funny term. It's not something we've really latched onto. I think for purposes of marketing and SEO, you want to latch onto what people are looking for. But we see ourselves as a sort of space as a service. And one of the encumbrances with leases is that you become beholden to these agreements that are beneficial to landlords and not to the people that want to work inside the buildings. And they tend to be 10 or 15 years because that's how they get financing and credit for their buildings. But very few companies ever have that kind of clarity into 10 or 15 years of who they want to be. So especially smaller companies, but even big companies, find themselves being landlords because they're subleasing it or who knows what. And part of what we want to be able to do is enable companies to consume space, and more than just space, a lot of different business amenities, in an elastic way, so that their business can stretch and shrink, or be what it wants to be, expand into other geographies at the interval or sort of increment that they want. So that's really what we're looking to do. And we don't bind ourselves to co-working, hot desking, hoteling. We see ourselves as a platform for to create environments where people can work and do meaningful work and provide amazing experiences for their employees or for themselves. Right. So I often say that we see ourselves as a sort of one-for-one replacement of all commercial real estate.
Great.
And Rachel's going to talk a little about residential real estate.
Yeah. So I think that's a really helpful overview, right? So that we all kind of understand the business and the idea behind it. And Rachel is the senior research designer. No design,
just research.
Research designer.
Design research.
Design research. Oh, I got it backwards. Okay.
I'm a really bad designer.
Design research. And so she has a PhD in social psychology from Princeton, and has a great deal of research background that she brings, and is going to share with us a case study of We Live.
Thanks. Thanks for being here, everyone. Like Dave said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of how we do research at WeWork and get a little bit into a specific case study of the type of research we've done and how we've actually applied it. But before I do that, I wanted to just kind of introduce my team, first of all, because I got this glamour shot done, so I just threw it in here. But mainly because I wanted to introduce my team. Because I wanted to just explain that we're kind of this very multidisciplinary team. And in kind of a non-traditional way, I've worked on other user experience teams, and most people tend to be from user experience backgrounds. But we're really multidisciplinary. So we have people who come from molecular biology, climate science, data analytics, architecture. And that kind of lets us look at things from more diverse perspectives and understand a lot of different methodologies that are both qualitative and quantitative. And my own personal background is in social psychology. So I tend to think more about things like the user perspective when it comes to our research. So for a lot of companies or businesses, you often just have access to, say, one building or one location that you can study at a particular time. And that's particularly true in architecture. One of the really cool opportunities of being a researcher at WeWork is that we have so many buildings open in a lot of different countries, and more opening every month. So this gives us kind of a really cool opportunity as researchers. We can have all these locations that are different and similar in a lot of ways, but also really unique. And that means we can test things really quickly and measure differences at a pretty large scale, which, especially for the architecture industry, is just a really cool opportunity. And what we think is especially important is that we can take our findings from one location and apply it to other locations in this kind of feedback loop with the design process, so that our research findings can actually influence our design iterations. So just some really brief examples. We've done research on, say, how we design our furniture so that we can talk to people about what makes them comfortable and how they're using objects like storage so that we can kind of maximize the way we're designing furniture. Or we've talked to groups like, say, mothers who are returning back to the workforce so that we can understand how to adapt our spaces and our management for them when they come back to work. But what I'm going to focus here is actually a particular case study on research that we've done at We Live. This is actually a little bit different from WeWork in that it's kind of a community-based apartment living situation with private apartments, but where residents also have access to common spaces. And it's especially like very community oriented. So at WeWork, we're always interested in how can we help build community. And since one of our tenets at WeWork is that we kind of want our workspaces to feel more like home, we're really interested in studying We Live because we can kind of take those findings and reapply them to the workplace by kind of gaining a better understanding of how people behave when they're in their more natural selves in their living environments. And we can understand how to build better communities in both our living and our working spaces. So the concept of community-based apartments really centers around this idea of community building for residents and making sure that people are actually able to build relationships. So we started out by just asking, like, what our communities actually look like? Do we have a community in our living spaces? And how can we actually help build that community? So in order to do this, we tend to use a variety of different research methods that are both qualitative and quantitative, like I mentioned before. Here, we were looking at doing things like interviews, a diary study, an online survey, and a social network analysis. And we did this in our 2 We Live buildings that have been open for a little less than 2 years, one right outside of DC, one in New York. And they have about 400 apartments in totals. And what, in particular, we wanted to pay attention to in these buildings is that they include a feature of designers called neighborhoods. And these are when 3 floors are connected by a set of communicating stairways with some shared common spaces that were meant to help people build community. But these kind of came at a cost. They're really expensive to just knock down a ceiling, start building staircases. Instead of having just one common area, which apartments tend to have, we have common areas every 3 floors. This is really expensive. So there wasn't really a business case for keeping them. So the We Live team and designers had been asked, like, do we really need these? And so that's when they came to talk to us. I think I can, yes. So we actually came at this thinking, like, maybe these smaller neighborhoods actually would help foster individual relationship building. And we were looking at some previous research in psychology that shows that propinquity really does tend to help people build relationships. And so we decided to explore this within our own We Live buildings by asking residents there who their closest friends in their building were. First, what we found was if we look, say, at the same floor, proximity does breed friendship, like previous psychology research has shown. Residents are almost 3 times more likely than a predicted baseline to be friends with other residents on their same floor. But what we were actually more interested in is if we look at the neighborhood outside of the shared floor, we found that people are still 1.5 times more likely to be friends with others in that neighborhood than a predicted baseline. And this was significant. And so overall, what we're finding is that neighborhoods actually are helping residents build relationships. So over 50% of relationships that residents at We Live had were within the same neighborhood. We also wanted to kind of visualize what these networks looked like. And this is an example from our Crystal City We Live. And the different colored dots are basically based on what neighborhoods people are in. And some of the larger dots are people who are more socially connected. So you can see they're kind of more central to a social network. And you can see this looks a little bit different than the neighborhood or how residents are forming community at Wall Street. And what we were able to do is also compare these networks. And we found actually that in New York, the social network was significantly more connected, central, and dense than at Crystal City. So then we could also look at what kind of residents are at these 2 buildings, or what kinds of spaces do we have? Why might these differences happen? What we found was that Wall Street residents tended to stay there they'd been there for almost the whole time. And so they'd really built up this very centralized network where everyone knew each other. And at Crystal City, where there were a lot of interns coming in for the summer, they kind of just made their own little social groups. We also wanted to say, like, where are these actual relationships forming? They must be somehow forming in neighborhoods, but where? And so we asked people about where they tended to find was the most social space for them in the building. And it could be in their neighborhood or somewhere outside. And we found that the most commonly reported area for people to socialize for themselves and also to find to be the most social area in the building overall was their neighborhood kitchen. And even speaking with residents, they talked a lot about meeting others or talking to others and getting to know them better while getting coffee in the morning or cooking or eating. And I guess as a lot of people in probably sociology and anthropology know, food is a really great way to bring people together. So what we found from this is that we can actually foster buildings in our community, and one already really exists. And it means that we can connect people through, especially areas and events in which they can kind of cook and eat with a smaller group of people that they share proximity with and that they share a common space with. And of course, this is just one finding from a much larger study. Here we were trying to learn about how we build common spaces in areas more generally in the hopes to understand like what we should build, how to build it, and in order to ensure our buildings are effective for a community and also for making people feel comfortable while they're living. And while we're doing this study for We Live, we also are trying to then do the same type of study at WeWork and try to understand how communities kind of differently form in a workspace and how we can kind of improve how people can form connections in the workspace. So in short, what we're doing is taking research findings about how people use and feel about these spaces and actually influencing our new architecture and designs based on these findings. And this is just kind of a basic summary of what that looks like. We're taking what our users' experiences are, forming that into data we can use, and then making predictions based on that data. And we can use that to then re-inform the experiences we're giving people. And we're kind of making it into this continuous loop where we're always allowing user feedback to affect the experiences that they have. And just a little bit more about how we've actually done this in WeWork. So in this example, what we did was we have data on how often people are reserving meeting rooms. And we wanted to see if we could make the optimal number of meeting rooms based on the number of offices that are in our buildings. Because if you have too few, people are always going to be kind of feeling overcrowded, like they can't get a meeting space. If you have too many, then you're kind of just wasting space that you could give people for something else. So what we wanted to do was be able to actually create an algorithm that would allow us to take all the information about a building, its floor plan, the number of occupants, and predict what kinds of layouts we should use in terms of specifically number of meeting rooms. And what we found was that if we do this, we're actually getting pretty good predictions from a computer. So what you can see here, that gray area is sort of that optimal number of conference rooms. And that's kind of based on what we heard from people when they felt, making sure that they felt comfortable in their building and like they had enough space, and also what the actual occupancy of meeting rooms and buildings was. And you can see that humans are a little bit all over the place in their predictions of how many meeting rooms and what size those meeting rooms should be in their buildings. But once you have a computer do it, there's a little bit more variance, or there's still some variance, but it's actually much better at predicting how many meeting rooms we should have. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do for everything, is just really take the experiences people have and make sure that we're using them to create the right experience for them. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Well, that was really wonderful, Rachel. I think what you were able to do is give us really a window so clearly into how you guys are using data to really both take from people's experiences and also then change the way we work. And when we had a pre-call yesterday, the three of us, and one of the things that we were talking about was how, the philosophy is not to look at what people need, but also what people don't know they need yet, right? And I love that, that human versus computer distinction there. Even though we lose as humans, at least there is a, we can interpret data and then use that to think about how we want to change the way we work. And WeWork. It was great. All right, so great name. And so when we think about, one of the things I think might be really helpful also to share with the group is something we talked about yesterday, which is about the surprises that you sometimes find in data. Because I think that sometimes when we look at data, we look at it to confirm our intuition about something that we know, but a lot of times we find things that surprise us. And so do you guys have examples of things that you've been able to find through data analysis that led to something that you didn't expect and then a change in how you did things?
So I think one of the things that we've been doing recently is looking at a lot of cross-cultural research. And I think one of the things we find surprising is we have all these ideas and preconceptions of what different cultures want or need before we go talk to people. And what you actually find can sometimes be something really specific that you didn't expect or really general that you weren't expecting at all. So sometimes, for example, we looked at all that meeting room prediction data, and what we were finding was that it looks like no one in China is ever booking a meeting room. Like, what's happening? Why, like, does no one in China have meetings? Like, what is going on? And when we actually went to talk to people there, they kind of told us that they didn't really like the system of having to like book a meeting room and go through and they use, the app doesn't work as well in China as it does anywhere else in the world. And so they kind of told us it's actually not, we had kind of gone with this, people were saying like, maybe we don't need as many meeting rooms there, and they were using all the meeting rooms. So it was a surprise of like, our data is not always exactly what we think it is. We sometimes need to also go to a place and like make sure that what people tell us is matching that data. And so that was just really interesting to learn.
That's a great example of interrogating the quantitative data with qualitative evidence, right? And I think that that's a really nice example of how they're both really important to understand what you're seeing.
Yeah, we're a big believer in you kind of need both, and they should always work together.
Yeah, I love that. Dave, did you have an example that kind of came to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I'm trained as an architect, and I always go back to like the architectural sort of, I call them myths. And so especially when it comes to workplace, there's a lot of sort of rules of thumb, but they're somewhat dated. They're not based off of the sort of the way people work today, what technology is doing to the work environment. Yeah. And there was a lot of ideas. So you were seeing on that left in that diagram was sort of our prescribed rules of like one medium conference room per 50 people, one large conference room. And then on the right was essentially now our new predictive model. And that's been one of the surprises for me as we've done some of this research, just seeing like the sizes in which people meet, the way that space is used. There's just a tremendous amount of waste. And more than I always thought there was, but there's way more than I realized there was. I think 80% of the meetings that happen in WeWorks are 4 people or less. So we do these like big boardrooms with 10 and 15 and 20 seats, and more often than not, they have 4 people in them. And if anyone walked around their office, they'd probably realize it's oftentimes the same. So those things have really caused us to rethink the way that we create space for people to convene in an either ad hoc or the predetermined way. And we've added more ad hoc meeting space, so different types of like phone booths or nooks or things that aren't reservable. So this idea of reserved versus non-reserved, and that we've really changed the ratio on that, which is sort of from a business perspective, freed up more space for us to monetize, but I also think is enabling us to deliver a better experience.
And I love that example too of you realize that people weren't needing these larger spaces all the time, because that actually links up really well with the research literature that shows that groups are more effective when they are in single digits. So that's great to hear that is being enacted in your space. One of the things that I also think is really interesting is, we talked about sources of data that you have a little bit, the qualitative, the quantitative, but do you want to share what other kinds of data that you have found useful to be able to make decisions?
Yeah, we've accessed a lot of different kinds of data, and one of the things that's great about being in a space like WeWork is that actually people are really willing to talk to us and share things with us that in a really open way, which has been really amazing. And so we often rely on, as I mentioned, like a lot of qualitative means, and so we do a lot of surveying of our members, and sometimes through online surveys, but sometimes we've gone in and really been a lot more specific. So when we've been worried about temperature in certain buildings, what we've done is put like readings of the temperature in each area, and right beside that way we're recording temperature, we just put a little way for members there in that building, within that very space, to tell us like how they feel about that temperature. So we're able to link up the actual temperature in that space with how people are feeling in that space. So we sometimes want to get more real-time data when it comes to surveys as well. We also collect data around, say, like kind of census data. We do a lot of interviewing. We also have information on, say, like how people are booking meeting rooms, because it's like we need to know whether or not something is booked so that everyone else knows they can't use that space. We also can look at that and say, how is the utilization of these spaces? So we have a lot of different like sources we can use for that kind of information as well, how people are actually using the space so that we can understand that. And what we always try to do is make sure whenever we use any information that it's something where we can then give something back to people. I think that's like always any kind of research, and I think you, as coming from like academia, you often learn that like research should always have some sort of advantage from the people you're collecting the research from. So we have tried, say, for example, we never really want to like invade people's privacy too much, but when we have things that are unbookable spaces like phone booths, we wanted to know how often are those utilized. So, and can we kind of like give that information back to people to better understand like when something is available. So the only time we've ever really we've used sensors in those areas and made sure everyone knows about it so that then we can know how often are these actually being used, and then eventually like can we create a system so that people know when something is kind of free for their use so they're not just like wandering around to find a space.
Yeah, that's nice. Did you want to add or?
Yeah, I mean, I think about our data in sort of various scales.
Yeah.
From like the urban level to, so where do people want to work?
Yeah.
I think it's important, and the things we're looking at there are like Foursquare check-ins or tweets or Instagram posts to see where are there areas of activity in a city, and not just census data because it tends to get stale pretty quickly. So that's kind of like the more macro level data, and as we think about what cities we want to go to and which cities are changing. And then as we go down to like the neighborhood, what's going on there, and then as we program the buildings, we start to look at more of the kind of data that Rachel's talking about. We try to, it's a combination of like looking backwards on how our platform is performing historically, but that oftentimes is kind of a lagging indicator of what we want to be. Mm-hmm. So we need to kind of put out ideas on where we think we want to take the product.
Right.
So we look at badge swipes of like how many people are coming into the building. We're also actively researching ways to instrument the buildings to collect data in an enriching and valuable way for the end users, like Rachel said. So we're like one of the things we're actively developing right now is a desk that gives you more control of your personal environment. So it's got a motion sensor in it. It's a sit-stand desk, but you can load your profile. Where I'd really like to see us get
is it buzz at you if you're like not standing enough or something? No, it just
vibrates and lights up. It's not like a shock collar. But give you real control, like of your personal comfort, like temperature. Right, localized thermal comfort is a very hard problem. I happen to have a little more natural insulation than you guys, so I may not need a sweater. But someone may want to wear their full sweater. So personal thermal comfort is a really, really tough topic that we needs instrumentation, needs real-time feedback from the people. It ties into mechanical systems, which are prohibitively expensive to get that localized. So we're looking at ways to do that, but I'll have that be somewhat of a feedback loop between the data that we're collecting and then what we can send back.
And what's really interesting also that I think that you guys touched on a little bit in what you said is that you also have to be projecting this into the future. You can't just be using the past as prediction for the future, although you use it quite a bit, but not completely. So how do you experiment? How do you figure out what some of those possibilities are going to look like, or whether they're going to work out? And do you have some experiments you could describe?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the benefits we have from growing at the rate that we're growing, when it comes to physical space, let's call it like a corporate occupier, just doesn't develop office space at the rate that we do, right? They might do different offices in different cities, but if I'm a large company and I open an office in New York, I'm probably not going to open another one for 5 years. Right. Then that's kind of fast. We open 20 buildings a month, so we can. We can't push code like a Facebook or NewYorkTimes.com and see but we can, when we open a new building, sort of introduce a new intervention. So one of the ones we did last year, was reshaping our common area. We really spent a lot of time on the common area to get people to convene. And we went from this kind of community bar concept to this center of gravity concept, where we kind of put all of the amenities and the food and beverage there to see if people would really kind of gather around it. And then we use different off-the-shelf technology to kind of monitor. Actually, we use a lot of like retail analytics software that'll track where people are going and footpaths. And that's a good example of one where, it kind of worked, but didn't totally work, so then we reconfigure it again. Or we will go back and renovate buildings as well, which is, again, something that we can do where a typical office company may not, a company that's making office space for their employees may not do that because that's kind of like where you're saving money. Or for us, it is the product, so we continue to reinvest in it. Phone booths are another good example where we'll quickly redeploy those. We've made those. Those used to be sort of built in situ. Now they're prefabricated, so if we miss the mark, we can deploy more of them. We're looking to do that with our conference rooms, making the spaces reconfigurable as possible so we can iterate and do more experiments after we open.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, I think we're always just interested in being able to, it's hard often with a physical space to be able to do this, but actually because we have so many buildings, it's really cool that we get to do that. And even right now we're trying some stuff with design where if we try a more minimalist design, what is the user sentiment at those buildings compared to ones where we use a different type of design? And or we can also look at pre-existing variables that might exist between different types of buildings and group those kind of buildings based on that variable and see if we have any differences in those buildings. And we also sometimes will just build spaces in a slightly different way and see how they work at two different buildings. So in the example of We Live, we only have 2 buildings, and so it's a much smaller sample, but we were still able to build common areas in a different way in each building. And so, for example, in one area, they tried doing a more open yoga studio. In the other, they made it more enclosed. And we actually saw huge differences in how willing people were to use the space. So once it's an enclosed space, people feel really comfortable and use it quite frequently and reported to us that it was one of their favorite areas in the building. Once it's a lot more open, even though it kind of looks cooler, they're exercising. People don't feel comfortable anymore using the space in the same way. So we have to make sure that they feel more comfortable using the space. So even just being able to look at how we differently manufacture those spaces and how it affects how people are using them, how they feel about them can be really cool.
Great. Well, we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I want to make sure we get a couple of them on the table here. So I want to turn to those now. One of the questions that we got was, how does WeWork think about optimizing both collaboration and individual productivity? Because potentially there's a trade-off between those, I think is inherent in that question, right? So what are your thoughts about that? With the communal focus at WeWork.
So the way we approach designing the spaces, we think about sort of giving people the right space at the right time to do the right kind of work. And I sort of the hair on the back of my neck stands up when I get the question of open office, closed office. It's it's just not a binary thing. What we try to do is give people access to all the different experiences that are better for their work type. I tend to like to wander around in the office and talk to people. I kind of like noise, but obviously there's other people that don't. So what we do there is, we will create a palette of experiences, be it a quiet room that has more of a library type setting, and it's got very strict rules about no talking. There's the phone booths, there's the nooks, there's the meeting rooms, then there's the large open office. And we tend to actually not have an opinion on that. Or at least we don't prescribe, we don't have a prescribed view on that. What we try to do is give people all the kind of experiences and environments that they can choose, just like you would at home. One of the early concepts of WeWork is make it feel more like home. Why does the office have to be this hard, uncomfortable plastic furniture, and at home I have this nice plush couch that I could sit on all day? That difference wasn't necessary. So we want to give people that same kind of control of their environment they have at home in the workplace.
Great. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting, I've been scanning the questions, they're fascinating questions. So another question that arose I think is really interesting is, what does your data show about when companies decide to move out of WeWork spaces, and why do you think that happens? Or does that happen?
Unfortunately, it does. So there's a bunch of different reasons, and it happens at the different scales of company. small companies. We break up the company size into small, medium, large, and enterprise. And we do it by employee count, which is 1 to 20, 20 to 100, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 plus. And we're taking learnings from those. But I think some companies, it's interesting. So I came to WeWork through acquisition. I ran a consulting business. It was about 60 people and felt very much and it was the first real business I started. And like, I needed to sign the lease. It's like, my sister just started a company and I told her, I said, Brianna, don't incorporate. Don't incorporate. Don't do it. It's a pain in your ass. Don't do it. First thing she does is creates an LLC. I was like, just don't do it. But there's some of those things that you just like feel like you need to do. So I think that there's a psychological component to having your own space.
Right.
So I think there's that, and I think that's a good learning for us to be able to give people that to sort of provide for that emotional feeling while still not feeling like they're consumed by like this brand of WeWork. And so we're actively working on that. But I think that's a real reason, and it's an interesting learning for us.
Could they sign a lease with you to get around that?
It's not about the lease. It's less so about like coming into a common area that's got a bunch
with other people.
Yeah, and like having the elevator door open to your floor, right? And it really feeling like your company, and that you're not co-working with other companies. And so there's ways for us to solve for that. I mean, in that sense, it's like traditional multi-tenanted floor. So but that's an interesting learning for us. Unfortunately, some companies go out of business, and that's something we can't control.
Right.
But I actually, that's an important thing for me, that we actually have a positive impact on that. That, we help companies succeed. So we strip away those things, whether it be through helping them get business or referring them to other members that need their work. But I'd say those are the big reasons. And then sometimes people use the platform intentionally in a transient way. It might be a swing space between offices. So there's a certain component of the platform that's meant to be short-term.
Sure. So another really interesting question is, and I think this is related to this changing nature of work and technology that I think we talked about a little bit yesterday, but I think it would be fascinating to share with the group is, do you see connected devices / the Internet of Things shaping both your designs and your data types in the future? I don't know I think data types is types of data that you're using. So.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. But
and how?
So in terms of, I'm sorry, it was data types?
Well, I think it's types of data. I think what they meant was, I'm guessing here, I'm putting my own interpretation of the question, is sort of the types of data that you use as well as how you design.
Yeah.
I think is the essence of
that
question.
Makes sense. Yeah, so in terms of how we design, I think there's just a lot of different ways that things can be affected. I mean, we definitely are right now working on making our app more integrated with the actual space so that when you interact with the space itself, it's much easier to do from your phone or your computer. And so, for example, like whether it is like booking a meeting room or figuring out what events there are or how to connect to other people in your building, things like that. And of course, that's also data that then we can look at and understand how to better those experiences or what's actually happening between our members or in our buildings. But also in terms of like how we design, we've been looking at a lot of more mobile workers. So we've been talking lately to people and looking at data from workers who might actually work in a more common space, who are actually moving from building to building, and it's because they're either working remotely from a core office that's in some other state or country, or that maybe they're kind of a freelancer who's moving around to different locations as well. And I mean, that's only something you're able to do if you have the internet and the ability to do that kind of stuff. So definitely also like being able to accommodate workers who are more mobile in that way and understand like what kinds of things they need that are different than someone who's just kind of sitting in an office and never really changing where they work out of.
And I think that this also relates to this, I think, comment that we raised in our yesterday conversation as well around millennials, and that your tenants are not just millennials, right? Which may be an assumption that people have.
Yeah,
right?
I think that, they think that it's co-workings for young people. Or that,
right.
Yeah, and it's really not. And what we want to be able to do is give these adaptable environments. And sort of going back to the last question a little bit, I mean, a big way that we can do that is by collecting that information. And the kind of information that we can collect is, through IoT or Internet of Things, is not necessarily recording people, but the decibel levels, which spaces are louder, motion, which spaces are fast, which spaces are slow. Which spaces have people congregate and get a certain amount of density? Which spaces get a lot of light versus low light? What kinds of activities are better suited for low light or high amounts of light? Natural light versus artificial light. There's offices now that are starting to change their lights throughout the day to get you more to like a circadian rhythm.
Yeah.
So those sort of things are also, as we can kind of collect that data and then tie that back to the research and see. And I think everybody wants that.
Yeah.
That's not just like young people that want to be comfortable in their work.
Right.
And what we talked about on our call lately is that young people may have more of a comfort level with voicing their opinion publicly because maybe they haven't been burned by the consequences of doing that, and that just comes with age. It's not a generational thing. But I think in that sense, it's not a generational problem,
right?
In my opinion.
And I think it's really interesting. And I guess we have one last question, which is, because I think this is too good of a question to forego, which is, how do you think about the Big Brother aspect of collecting such kind of granular personal data? And related to that, are the people who are working in WeWork spaces or WeLive spaces, are they just naturally, responsive to surveys, or are they required to do this, right? Is that part of the deal? So
I'll answer the Big Brothery one, because it's something I'm super sensitive to. It's all anonymized, and we're only doing it. It's been a clear directive of mine is that we can only collect data if there's a way that it adds value to the user. Right? Like I get a lot of value out of my iPhone, so they probably are collecting a tremendous amount of data from me, and I'm okay with that. And so it goes back to like the personal comfort. I want to measure the temperature so I can make sure we get it right for you. We're not measuring your body temperature or any of those things. So it's really about measuring the environment, and less so that Rachel is walking up and down the hall. Mm-hmm. It's how many people, and we've been pretty particular about that kind of stuff. And it's measuring the environment and sort of the amount of people, but not the particular person. And I think if or when we start to do that, it would probably we'd be engaging the company and helping them get insights about themselves. Mm-hmm. So if as a company they wanted to boost productivity, we say, okay, well, we're going to work with you to figure out a way to see what kinds of measures, do you want to do it by department? And we're partnering with companies like Humanize, who's a sponsor, to help us do very cool things on that front. But I think it would always be in collaboration with the members. And Rachel can talk about the surveys.
Yeah, so no one is forced to do surveys. That would be really horrible. But
they're voluntary.
Yeah, so you see higher responses on surveys where the things are relevant to people. So for example, in our living spaces, whenever we run a survey there, we get an incredibly high response rate, because you can imagine like something that affects your living situation is huge to you. So of course you want to answer something where someone is like, hey, we want your feedback to improve the space for you. When it comes to sending surveys to a workspace, we get a little bit lower of a response rate than we do in a living space, but people still care about what affects their environment. So in surveys about something like temperature, we actually had a really high response rate, even though it's really boring, because people want to really tell us. Yeah, compared to when we do a census, people are really nice about responding, but it's just not as high of a response rate. It's just we want to like know who is in our spaces, and people are really great about sometimes giving us that information, but they don't have to, and sometimes they don't want to. Whereas when it comes to things that affect their living or working environment, people actually really want to give that feedback, because it gives them a way of, changing the actual space that they're in. And we try to make sure that when we take that feedback, we actually can improve their space, so that we're not just, taking something from them and not giving anything in return. And I think people have been really amazing about just wanting to make sure, and even when it doesn't affect them directly. So when we've done research, say, for new mothers, some of them were no longer new mothers, but because they cared about the other new mothers who were going to be returning to work in the buildings, they actually really still wanted to give their responses, because even though it might not affect them directly, it affects a group that they care about, and they want to make sure that the experience is good for those people as well. So I think it comes down to just people being invested in where they work and where they live.
And on that note, I want to thank you both very much for the wonderful comments and insights you've given us.
Thank you.